Welcome to another episode of the Wider Lens podcast, where we go beyond the frame to discover the creative voices behind Ontario's film and television production community. I'm your host, Annie Bradley, and I'm incredibly excited about the very special episode we have in store for you today to celebrate Pride Month. In the last few years, we have witnessed an extraordinary push for queer representation and inclusivity in the film and television industry. Audiences all over the world are connecting with groundbreaking shows shot right here in Ontario, like Sort of, Schitt's Creek, What We Do in the Shadows, and The Umbrella Academy. And queer content seems to be taking the entertainment industry by storm. We're going to be shining a spotlight on queer film and television with three passionate DGC Ontario members who are a part of that community. Director Pat Mills.
There's like a galaxy of different queer experiences.
Picture editor Maureen Grant.
And it's not asking permission to be here or to live our lives authentically. It's just kind of like, here we are. What do we do with this?
And production manager Moe Rai.
I always feel like I have that pressure of representing, but I always try to pave other people's ways to grow and motivate them.
From behind the camera to the production office to the editing suite, our guests will shed light on the challenges they've encountered, the nuances of working within a predominantly heterosexual and cisgender industry, and what we can do to create a more inclusive film and TV landscape. Together, we're going to explore what this surge in representation means to our community, the power of seeing yourself reflected authentically on screen, and the profound impact representation has for future generations. Join us as we embark on this enlightening conversation about creativity, authenticity, and community today on The Wider Lens. So to kick things off, I'd like to give our guests a moment to introduce themselves, who they are, and what they do in the industry, and how they would define themselves in both their personal and professional lives. Maybe we can start with you, Pat.
Sure. Well, my name is Pat, and I'm a writer-director, and I came up through short films and independent features, and now I've been dabbling in television. My main thing is amplifying queer stories, and I try and push as much queerness into all narratives whenever I can, in every genre possible. I would want to be able to place these queer stories and narratives in every genre, from comedy to horror. I don't know how I'd actually identify myself personally or professionally, but queer filmmaker.
How about you, Maureen?
I would also identify as a queer filmmaker. It's a great way to put it. So my name's Maureen Grant. I'm a picture editor. I work in both film, short film, feature film, and television. More recently moving into the television space, doing comedy, drama, any kinds of stories that appeal to me and where the collaboration is fun and positive, and I try to take on as many queer stories as I can.
And Moe.
Hi, my name is Moe Rai. I'm originally from Syria. I'm an immigrant to Canada. I was born and raised in Syria, Damascus, and came to Canada in 2000. My parents immigrated in the 90s. On a personal level, I feel I'm stuck between two communities. I don't feel like I belong there, and I don't feel like I'm 100% belonging here. So it's a blessing in a way, because I feel like I have a lens of both worlds and I understand both worlds, but it's a curse at the same time because I don't feel like I belong in either. On a professional level, I started in the non-union world. Before that, my family didn't believe in a career in arts. There's 5 things you can do. You can either be a doctor, pharmacist, engineer, lawyer, or disappointment to your family. So I chose the last one and I went into an art career. I went to film school, and since then, since 2008, I've been working career in industry, starting in locations, then moved into production management, and recently line producing as well.
I'd say the last few years, I think we can all agree, we've seen an encouraging rise in the representation of queer community, both on screen and behind the scenes. An audience seem to be really connecting to inclusive content, from Schitt's Creek to What We Do in the Shadows, to The Umbrella Academy, to Sort of, RuPaul's Drag Race, etc. I mean, listen, I always think we have a huge way to go, but what this encouraging content means to you and to sort of see it move into the more traditional landscape. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about that from your perspective, Pat.
Yeah, I mean, when I first got the job to direct Lifetime's first queer Christmas movie, I didn't really know the genre that well, and I didn't understand the impact that it would actually have. We tried to make it authentic as we could. The writer was queer. The leads were married and queer. Threw Fran Drescher in there, who's been an ally forever. And I remember Fran on set said, this is going to mean so much to so many people. And I'm a bit cynical. I was like, a Christmas movie? Really? And when it came out, it was like Twitter exploded, both love and hate. It touched so many people and people watch it year round. I think it broke records with streaming. I get emails still, even though I made it like 3 years ago. And it just made me realize that people really needed to see themselves represented in glossy, mainstream, no conflict. Like they really, really wanted that back at them because queer people have been excluded from these very mainstream genres for so long that people were starving for it. And I found it really interesting that this came out at the same time that Clea Duvall's Happiest Season came out. And I really loved that movie. But a lot of people criticized that movie because it was a bit triggering for some people because it was about acceptance, where the Christmas setup was like, there was no conflict at all. Like the only thing that was negative was somebody got a job promotion and they had to take it and move. Like there was no real conflict in it. And it was just so interesting to see how many people were starving for a very glossy movie that they could just turn their brains off and bake and watch queer people fall in love.
Maureen, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what does this explosion in queer content mean to you?
For me, it's just that there's more variety in the kinds of characters and the kinds of stories that we get to see. There were some really important shows like The L Word and things to kind of hold on to, but you may not see yourself exactly in that show. And that's a huge burden on any one show to take on. So just more is more for me. Now there's stories that are dark, complex, with complicated characters, but there's also the fun stuff too. And we have RuPaul's Drag Race, which I adore. So for me, more is more. And as an editor, I don't always get to choose whether I have the option to work on something queer. And the opportunities used to be much more few and far between. But now it's like I'm starting to feel like these projects are coming my way and there's more and more of them. And now it's sort of, that's what I feel like my identity is now, kind of the reason people would approach me to collaborate on a project, as opposed to before it was like, I wasn't sure if maybe I didn't have the credits at the time to work on some of the things that were coming out. But yeah, the landscape has definitely changed. It's a good thing.
Moe, I think you have a really interesting perspective here because you come from those two worlds. You sort of live between those two worlds. So you come from a world that is very different culturally into this landscape as a queer person, and you see this landscape changing. What does that mean to you? I mean, you have a completely different perspective not having grown up here.
It is actually, and it's funny because I always talk about how in North America, people tend to forget that whatever they produce on the screen or showcase, especially if it becomes a hit, the whole world is watching and the whole world try to behave like or try to pass some policy that are similar. So when I grew up, I saw a lot of Will and Grace, even though, it had characters that are a bit more flamboyant and sassy. It's great, which I'm all of those. But throughout the years, it's really good to have seen different characters and different examples of queer and LGBTQ on the screen and different characters that are regular people with regular careers and they're having similar fights in the world. So I feel like it's really great where we are. We have great examples. We have moved on from the stereotypical characters. But I do think we still need more work to represent more and make stories that not necessarily about gender or sex, but it's more about having people relate to us and seeing that we're normal. We go through the same struggles as everyone, if not more, because there's different layers of culture and identity that we go through as well. And it's funny because I do see, it's very important to see characters on the screen because you feel sense of belonging, you see examples, self-acceptance is very important, especially in our community. And as an example, for instance, I don't see a lot of Arab or Muslim stories like that portray such image of what we really are. Like if you see any Arab or even gay Arabs or even queer Arabs, especially because it's a taboo where we come from. But over here, we're looked on in a different way as well. Like any example, if you see on TV of Arab or Muslim, they're usually terrorists or gangs or low income individuals. So representation is really important. And the more I think we give those characters on the screen, the more we educate and we raise awareness, and people can relate as well.
I think what's really interesting here is a talk about the queer community and the depiction of queer characters. We have a massively broad spectrum here, from queer characters that are acceptable to the regular cisgender world, perhaps change hearts and minds slightly or open doors slightly, as opposed to the realities of the queer world and perhaps more dramatic queer storytelling. Do we find ourselves walking a fine line between ensuring authentic representation without perpetrating harmful stereotypes, or that kind of thing where we're trying to make it palatable for the general public as opposed to specific to the community? I think when you're in indie film, there's kind of a way you can tell much more authentic stories. I'm still sure there's challenges in regards to funding sometimes, or distribution and reaching a larger audience. But at the same time, once you move into that landscape of television, it's a very different world. Maybe we could just sort of talk about that a little bit. Maureen?
Yeah, I think there's just like a lot more people in the mix when it comes to television, and maybe more computer laptops that a script and content has to get by, more approvals, more likability, more test audiences, and that's a really hard thing to get certain content past. And like, in my experience, when I'm going through these test audiences processes, whether it's for indie film or television, one thing that keeps coming back is likability. And sometimes, like even on a film called Riot Girls, where it's not about likability whatsoever. It's anarchist girls defending themselves in an apocalypse. I'm not quite sure why we were concerned with one of the female characters being likable. I mean, that was her whole thing, was to not be. She was a tough badass. And so not everything is meant to pass these kinds of broad tests. It would make the work a lot less interesting in that case. I think there's got to be room for both the stories that are meant for a wider audience and more niche indie stuff, or just things that are meant for the queer community, for us as ourselves.
You've definitely now, Pat, straddled both of those worlds, right? You've sort of started off in the short films with a very authentic voice through the indie features. What have you notice now that you're moving into that landscape of television? What have been those challenges?
This is the tricky thing. There's like a galaxy of different queer experiences. And television, because as Maureen was talking about, more gatekeepers, the budget's higher, some of those really interesting stories that we haven't heard before don't get in. And because they need to be digestible for a mainstream audience. I mean, I not only direct, but I write and I try to create my own stuff. I keep pushing those stories forward, even though they get more passes, because they're really important to me. And it's the only thing that I can actually authentically speak to from my experience. And when we're talking about positive queer representation, I'm actually becoming really attracted to an authentic negative queer representation, as long as it feels authentic. And like what Maureen was talking about, for us. So I don't want bigotry on Twitter or people reacting to a queer movie and they think we're all going to hell because drag queens are out there talking to our children. I don't want those bigots ruining my wicked fun. I still want to write something that plays with juicy, negative queer people that I have experienced in my life, and I want that to be entertaining. And if we keep pushing those stories, people will get used to them and they will accept them and maybe look forward to them because they're actually entertaining. And that's all people watch television for anyway. It's a responsibility that I feel to not accept no for an answer and just keep knocking on that door.
I just had the opportunity to work on a really dark, hilarious queer comedy, and I'm so glad it exists. And it just talks about like all the things that are wrong with this world and why we shouldn't want to live in it. And it's not asking permission to be here or to live our lives authentically. It's just kind of like, here we are. What do we do with this? I think those are the kinds of stories that are really appealing to me personally.
Me too.
You want to open that door and introduce those queer characters from the full spectrum of the queer experience into mainstream television and sort of almost, I always say, like, when we don't introduce them as a queer character at all, that's when we'll know we've really won. You know what I mean? When they're just a character in a landscape of characters. But at the same time, there are gatekeepers. We are living in a highly polarized world right now, but I applaud you all for just trying to, like I do, push the envelope forward and not accept no. That's always the greatest thing, that there's room for all sorts of characters, whether or not we like them or not. I want to talk a little bit about personal responsibility. And I wonder just whether or not you have that feeling of pressure every time you go into a job to sort of push the envelope forward, be the best version of it, make sure that you're doing great hiring practices. And maybe, Moe, you could speak to that from your perspective when you're putting a team together.
I do feel such pressure. Like when I grew up, I didn't have examples of me to look to or seek advice. I'd never met a queer Middle Eastern filmmaker. I'm sure they exist. I meet them now more than often. But before, when I grew up, I didn't have that. So whenever I go, whatever job interviews, whatever jobs I do, I always feel like I have that pressure of representing, being a good example, but also have to go through everything that the production gives on me and all my internal feelings as well. So it is hard, but I always try to empower and give examples to other people so they can succeed and try to pave other people's ways to grow and motivate them. Being queer, one element that we all share is fighting. We're always fighting ourselves to accept ourselves. We're always fighting the community to accept us or to break through barriers. And it depends if you're coming from a different world, for instance, like myself, there's other fights that you're trying to break into as well, of acceptance, of family, of religion, of all of that. And then coming to a different world of belonging and then introducing North America to your lifestyle. And what do you agree with it? What do you don't agree? So I try to offer as much of a safe space for everyone on my sets or productions. It could be to the little of having conversation with the people, making sure when we do the general meetings that everybody's aware of the harassment policy or the grievance policy. When people know that they have solution or they have ways of communicating or voicing out a problem or something that happened to them, they feel that there's a safe space that's been created as well. In hiring practices, I always talk to the keys that I hire when they crew up for their departments. I always tell them to consider diversity and inclusion. And even if they have their people, to at least interview. Because when you interview people, at least you know that they're on your radar, you're aware of them. Maybe now you're fully staffed, but at least you build that connection. And on the other hand, that person gets the experience of their interview, gets the networking, feels that they are doing stuff and they are moving towards something. So those are some of my practices that I try to put in place and try to work with.
Sometimes you're the only queer person on a set, or you're the queer person in the head of the creative room or whatever it is, and people want to clear queer content with you, which then puts an insane amount of pressure that you have to speak for an entire community that is, as I said before, a galaxy. So it's like, I can't clear that joke. But I can say I don't have a problem with it, but I can't be the voice for all of these other people. And I have to acknowledge my privilege as a white person too, right? Just in terms of feeling included on set. Creating a safe space is very important to me. When I was a kid, I acted for a few years, and I remember being 12 years old and going to a set, and I felt like, oh, this is really cool. This is like a family, and I felt like I could grow, and I got a little bit more confidence out of the experience because I felt wanted. But then there was one crew member who, when no one else was around, would call me a And as a 12-year-old, having like a beloved crew member that everybody loved who would secretly bully me, who was like a grown man, he was in his 30s or 40s, I shut down. And I felt like I couldn't talk about it. And this was at a time where these safe spaces didn't exist. But what I did was I shut down. You know, the first couple of years of high school, I was basically mute because every single time I would express joy, I'd act fruity. And somebody would inevitably bully me and push me down and make fun of me. So I became ashamed of my personality. But the thing is, it made me a very, very keen observer. And I've talked about this in therapy so many times, but I think there's a reason why I sit at a monitor and I watch. I'm trying to think of, reframing my trauma in some sort of superpower. And for me, I've been on sets where I heard after we wrapped that somebody was misgendered on purpose. And it really, really bothered me. And I'm trying to create a space, or I want to normalize speaking up, because I still think that in this industry, people are afraid of losing their jobs or being that person that's difficult to work with. But I think it's really important as a queer person, especially because we've experienced this, is to just ensure that it's super cool to be yourself and people will back you up if anybody steps out of line. And I do love that our culture of sets is changing. People are becoming a bit more sensitive to how they treat other people. But I think the film industry especially has a history of abuse. I was treated like crap when I was coming up, so I'm going to treat you like crap. Thankfully, that's changing.
We do come from a long lineage of exclusionary practices in a certain way, and a very specific patriarchal hierarchy. And I think that it is great to see that changing. Post has always been sort of cisgender, straight male world. Maureen, maybe you could talk a little bit about moving into that world, but also to just carving out that space. And do you also feel that personal responsibility?
It's funny because, people always think of post-production and editors as male cisgendered white men. That's just that's where their mind gravitates. It's funny because there are always being female editors. And so it coincides with tech as well. It's sort of this renewed assumption that people who use computers are male, and somehow female editors got lost in all of that conflation. But they've always been here. There always have been. There's a number of female Canadian editors that I know of and look up to and have been lucky enough to meet. And so it's not like they don't exist. It's harder to carve out space, though, to not just be the one female token on a team is unusual. There are plenty of us now, and I feel so lucky to have a huge community and as well very accepting male colleagues. So I don't often feel like I have to assert myself. I've earned that at this point. I've worked really hard, and I don't feel like at this point is questioned, but it certainly is not an easy industry to break into by any means, because it's connections. You have to convince somebody to give you the opportunity to cut something. How do you learn and grow without getting your hands on material? I worked really hard to make my own way. And so now I think about, how can I open the door for somebody else? How can I make this a little bit easier for somebody else? And so I'm not alone in this work. There are a lot of us who really care about the next generation and making sure it's much more inclusive and diverse than it has been in the past. It just takes time for it to get there. But there are a lot of us who are doing a lot of mentorship, constantly interviewing new assistants. Students often talk to me and ask if I'll do an interview just to talk about what it's like to be an editor. And so the work is ongoing. It's constant, but it's exciting.
Was there anybody, Pat, when you were starting to make films that you saw as somebody that inspired you, that whose career or whose authentic voice you felt, encouraged you to go on this journey that you've been on?
Several. I think that around the mid-90s is when I was really wanting to become a filmmaker, and I really admired that new queer cinema world of Todd Haynes and Cheryl Dunye and the mainstreaming of, oh my God, what's his name? John Waters. So it's all of that stuff. I was seeing my sense of humor and my queer sensibility before I really accepted it myself. I was seeing it on screen. And when I turned on the television, Kids in the Hall would play. And that was huge for me. It's here's Buddy Cole on network television being as gay as he wants to be. He was in on the joke. This is a queer man for queer people. And that really inspired me. And I think that you didn't see a lot of that representation before then. I remember seeing Safe by Todd Haynes in the theater. It's not a queer movie, but there's a queer sensibility and a sense of humor throughout it. So I think that I was always really drawn to that offbeat, independent film kind of queer cinema. And that's what really inspired me.
On a personal level, like I get inspired a lot from my dad because of the way he works and his ethics of works and whatnot. Especially because I didn't have a lot of, when I grew up, a lot of examples of queer filmmaker because they exist, but they just not out in public to state the fact. I learned a lot about my craft and the pride of your craft and how you work and your communication. I learned all of that from my dad. In recent days, I think there's a lot of great projects that I've seen, like Pose. I don't know if you all know that project. It talks about the beginning of the ballroom world. It's a trans story about how they lived during those times. And I feel like I gravitate more into such projects. Sort of is a great example as well. And sort of actually hits me in a different way because it's a Muslim, South Asian character and trans as well, which is breaking so many barriers. But also it's not so centered on their gender. It's more centered about what sacrifice they're doing in their life and the relationship with their mom who, she's trying to accept them. She's walking towards them, but they are, putting barriers because they're not comfortable with that. So it gives you such a different outlooks and more relatable stories, I feel, for both ends. Like for the straight cis person who are watching this and seeing that these people are people like us, behave like us, they have emotions the same, they're driven in the same way. And also for members of the LGBTQ community, because it gives us example on how to allow people to accept us or moving into their world. And also at the same time, it gives me a window of their life that I don't know about. I'm exposed to trans life, but I don't know what goes into their life and what kind of struggles. So I feel like I'm learning, I'm feeling like I'm being relating, and it's awareness at the same time. So I tend to like projects like those.
Maureen, maybe just anybody that really inspired you. I know that there's been a lot of wonderful female editors, but even, female filmmakers or anybody that's inspired you when you were coming in that made you want to spend all kinds of time in a dark room.
I don't know how I gravitated towards editing. If I look back, I was actually a visual arts major and I was really into art forms like music and punk and riot girl and feminist art. And those were sort of like lower budget projects and aesthetics. And that kind of led me to video artists like Sadie Benning, who was like a young queer filmmaker who made these experimental, I can't remember what the camera was called, like a Pixel Vision or something. And just these really like poppy short videos that deconstructed gender and identity. And, they're really cool at the same time. So that's sort of like the kind of work that I loved when I was just coming out of art school into film school. And then in film school, I started like doing hand processing and optical printing and getting into the more like physicality of film and working with stuff from there. It was a long time until like films that I really connected with came out. So editing a little bit was separate from art that I admired. And it seems like now at this point in time, those kinds of things have collided, where it's like my actual interests and vibes and my background and my interest in arts and culture, what I bring to my work now is really relevant. Whereas before it was like really separate. People are like, we're doing a Riot Girl soundtrack. I'm like, great, I'm on it. I feel like a lot more at home on a lot of projects that I work on. And I feel like I have something special to give because I'm queer, not I have to put that stuff away and just work on someone else's project. Like I had an opportunity to work on a film called Bloody Hell with Molly McGlynn last year. And I got to, not only like put my personal sensitivities into the project and the collaboration, but the music and like using the song Barbie Girl ironically or making it into a monster jam. It's such a dream. That's where the creative spark, comes alive as an editor. And so now it feels like everything has just culminated to this moment where the things that I like and admire and the music that I like and admire, like feminist punk and post-punk, all comes into play.
I think I'd be remiss. I know we touched on this briefly, Pat, at the beginning. You spoke about this, but about the polarization of the queer experience right now in the landscape, in the political world that we are living in, especially in the US, but with the criminalization of gender-affirming care and bans on drag performances and book banning and, all of these things. But I don't think Canada is immune to any of this, quite frankly. And we're seeing some real blowback in parts of the country. How does this change the importance of the stories told now by all of you with this landscape? And how do you think queer content should address these political and social realities affecting the community? Maybe, Pat, you could start.
That's a hard one to answer. I don't know if I have the answer, I'm going to be honest. But I don't think anything should change. We should keep pushing these stories forward. I can't let any bigotry get in the way of my creativity. I never have and I never will. And it just makes me a little bit more passionate about the stories that I want to tell. And that we shouldn't give so much power to some douche on Twitter who calls me a dildo for no reason because I made a queer, heritage minute. Shut up.
I 100% support that. Is there anything that you guys feel like that isn't being represented? Stories that you feel should be being told now that you feel we should potentially be focusing on?
I would add a story, actually. I remember more than 5 years ago, someone was trying to get a story made, which is about a gay couple who are trying to adopt. And in Canada, it's actually extremely hard process to go through. And there's a big screening process that you go through as well. They did have example of a gay couple who the story was based on, but they didn't know much about what was going on and what needs to be done. So I introduced them to a lot of contacts, 519 at the time as well. And we met through people who have gone through the process, people who do the process, who do the screening, and also who are professors who have been speaking with that. And surprisingly, there's not many broadcasters that want to talk about this or shed a light on it because it's still a touchy subject for a lot of people. We need more stories of those things, like the normal human being things. Any couple might think about marriage. They might think about building a family. They might think about coexistence with religion, with family. So all these regular stories, I feel like they need to be amplified more with a queer lens on them for awareness, education, and also for belonging as well.
I was just thinking about with your question about what kinds of stories would we like to see. And I was just thinking, I was watching The Last of Us and it's not exactly my cup of tea. I don't play games. It's a fun apocalypse show though. But then that third episode where the two men fall in love and are subsistence farming and growing strawberries. I could have watched a whole season of that. I was like, can we just be queer people who do random things? Can we be queer people in situations that aren't particularly queer? Can we just be characters in films doing things?
I remember a couple of shows that I was watching in Britain, and I can't remember the titles now, but they just never, you didn't even really know that the characters were queer until 2 or 3 episodes in when something, you know what I mean? They were just there, right? And everybody, it wasn't that you had to introduce them as the queer character into the, that sort of thing. It was just they come home and their partner's there and their partner's same sex or whatever, you know what I mean? And it just wasn't a big deal. And I thought, what a beautiful way. You're already into the story. You're already into the characters and you're invested in this. We go out the door into the world every morning and there are people in a galaxy of queer culture that exist in everyday life, who have hopes and dreams, who want to have families and get married and fall in love and all of the other things that everybody else, they're just human like we all are. So I think maybe what I want to just touch on at the end here, you guys have all done very well in your careers. And if you were talking to the younger generation, would you have any advice for them?
Well, I do talk to the younger generation often in these interviews. I was on the board of the CCE for a few years and I organized a lot of events and I would meet a lot of students and emerging filmmakers. The advice that I give to emerging talent is to look for your people. Look for people who want to work with you. Look for people who will vibe with the kinds of stories you want to tell, you as a person, and don't try to make yourself fit into an office or a project's culture that doesn't suit you. It's just not going to have any longevity. Look for the people who you can have a lifelong career collaboration with, not just a one-time project. And sometimes that means there's not a lot of money. I've worked on enough things where I chose the art over the paycheck. But it's gotten me further because I believed in those people. A little web series or a little short film can build a relationship that can go really far. Make meeting people your job, but also like make sure that you're being treated well.
Find a community, find your people, work with your people. Another thing that I would probably say is don't let your fear of what the market wants affect or limit your creativity, because sometimes media is a little behind the culture and they eventually catch up. So by the time that you've got your project ready to go, people will catch up to you. So I would just say, like, go with your gut and like push those stories that you feel people aren't ready for forward.
I would advise young filmmakers to be resilient, to have tough skin, and not give up easily. We have those skills in a way because we come from a galaxy of, I like that word, we come from all colors of the rainbow. We always fighters, we're breaking barriers. So just keep on doing that, keep on being resilient and hard skin, and also ask for help. Like, there's a lot of people who are willing to help you, have coffees, have Zoom coffees, ask for mentorship, to be mentored. A lot of people are afraid to ask that question, and they're surprised when there's a lot of people who would actually take up your offer and help you through your process or guide you or even connect you to people. So I would say don't be discouraged from asking for help.
Snap, snap.
Thanks, Pat.
I think what I'm hearing from all of you is that we need more mentorships, more initiatives, et cetera, to try and get more people coming up through the industry and avenues inwards. I know that the Toronto Queer Film Festival and the Inside Out Film Festival are returning this summer along with a new initiative they have, I think, called the Trans Film Mentorship Program. So that's, super encouraging to see. And if we can find any more initiatives, or if you guys know any more initiatives that you'd like to promote here, we'd love to put them up on the Wider Lens website as well and put it out in our socials. So please feel free. And anybody listening, reach out to us so that we can amplify those and make sure that the community can get access to them. I'm always inspired by the work that all three of you continue to do every day as part of the queer community, but also as fabulous filmmakers, and was honored that you came. You're an inspiration for many, many people, let me tell you. I know that personally, and I'm thrilled that you're all members of the Directors Guild, and I want to thank you so much for coming and having the conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Annie.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This podcast was produced by Katie Jensen at Vocal Fry Studios. Our video producer is John Packman. Our executive producer is Anne-Marie Stewart. And special thanks to Aviva Cohen and Laura DiGirolamo at DGC Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley. We'll see you next time on Wider Lens. We would like to acknowledge that we are situated in Takaranto and are grateful to be working on this land. We acknowledge the land that we are recording this podcast on today is the colonized territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These treaties and other agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We acknowledge and share our gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, caregivers of the land, and keepers of its stories for thousands of years.